Fill to capacity. Crazy good stories and timely topics. Podcast for people too stubborn to quit and too creative not to make a difference. Inspiring, irreverent, and informative. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Pat Benincasa, and welcome to Fill to Capacity. Today's episode, it's all about people, creative problem solving, and the scientific method. My guest is Isabella Engelbach. Welcome, Isabella. Nice to have you here.
Thanks, Pat. It's great to be here. And everybody knows me as Bella, except for my mom. So please call me Bella.
Okay, I'd like to give our listeners just a brief bio. You are author of Creatively Lean, How to Get Out of Your Way and Drive Innovation Throughout Your Organization. You also host a podcast called The Edges of Lean, and Bella coaches organization leaders to create problem-solving environments through a communication and testing process where people drive improvement. Now, from everything I've read about you, it's clear you have a passion for the scientific method and how it taps into creative problem solving.
Yeah, and that was actually a really hard thing for me to figure out, Pat. So I was working in a pharmaceutical company, trained as a scientist, and I was learning about continuous improvement and lean and Six Sigma and these types of methodologies. And at the same time, I was learning about the creative problem-solving methodology, which is another problem, obviously another problem-solving methodology. And this really hard thing was going on, both in my head and with the people I was working with. So there were the people who were all about the continuous improvement, scientific problem-solving approach. And then there were the people who were involved in creative problem-solving. And I loved them all. I thought they were all great, and they all had, in my perspective, a piece of the elephant, right? So, somebody has a leg and somebody has a tail and maybe somebody else has an ear, and they all think it's a fan or a tree trunk or a rope, and they're missing the elephant. I still actually don't know what the elephant is, Pat. I'm still trying to figure out the whole elephant myself. But the thing that was really hard was that the people who were into the sort of the science and the engineering side of it would look at the creative stuff and say, well, that's not data-driven. It's not rigorous enough for us. And then the people on the creativity side would look at it and say, all you want to do is standardize things, and you'd have no room for innovation. Yep. And obviously, being in a pharmaceutical company, we need innovation. So it was really a struggle kind of in my own head. And then people honestly kind of getting along with each other. The more I thought about it, the more I figured it out for myself. And that's kind of what my book is about, is how do these things work together?
Well, let's break this down into a few pieces. Your passion for the scientific method. Now, Bella, I'm an artist, and I have to fess up. When I think scientific method, I see a scientist holding a beaker and surrounded by her lab equipment, doing notation. What do you mean by scientific method?
The scientific method is the problem-solving method that scientists use to not only design and conduct experiments, but also to learn from those experiments and take those learnings into the next experiment. So if you think about that, Pat, that's probably the same thing you do in art, right? Yes. So if you're a visual artist, you may be working with different paints, different pigments. There may be a certain hue that you want to go for. You will probably do some studies or just some mixing where you'll see, well, is this the hue I want? Is it delivering what I want it to do? What did I learn from doing that? And the next time you might do it a little bit better. That's exactly the same thing, right? So we're doing the same thing, but we imagine it's something different. And so the thing that I saw with the scientific method was that the people in my organization who are scientists, they were really good at that when they were in the lab.
Mhm.
But as soon as they got out and they had to tackle business problems, they struggled and they kind of went into wishful thinking. And that would kind of be the same thing as an artist saying, I'm going to make my great masterwork. I don't know if you ever think that, right? And I'm just going to paint it once. I'm never going to do any studies. I'm never going to try something out and see what I think. I'm just going to do it, and it's going to be the masterwork, and it's going to tell the story, create the emotions that I want it to create in my viewers. I don't know, Pat, you'd have to tell me, does that ever work?
Not that I know of. No, I have to research things. When I build out of glass and steel in public buildings, it's not like loosey goosey. Let's see what the spirit brings. By the time I've gotten there, I've worked with structural engineers, researched the building, weight loads to suspend a work of art. So I don't think we're that far apart. I agree with you. But something you said strikes me. When you take the scientist out of the lab into business world, there may be a little bit of struggle going on. And it makes me wonder, Bella, are we compartmentalized? And does your work kind of go towards that compartmentalization, like being aware of it?
I think that that is a very astute observation. And I think that comes out of our academic training and our development, right? So at some point in school, somebody decides that they're going to be an artist, and somebody else decides that they're going to be a scientist. And then we study and we learn and we get trained in those disciplines. And if we're not careful, we don't learn what the other people are working on, right? Now, your work is so interesting, right? Because you have to work with engineers, and you have to work with people who are doing the math,
Mhm.
and you have to get all that stuff right, because you don't want something crashing down on people's heads and getting destroyed, obviously. So you have this you have a fabulous opportunity to do that. But a lot of people, I think, have a bad experience with one or the other, and then they specialize. And so my story about art was this: I used to love drawing and painting. I was not, I think, particularly talented, but I enjoyed it very much. And I had a lovely, beautiful art teacher in 8th grade who really wanted to encourage us, but he didn't always know the right thing to say. So one day I made a painting, and it was a painting of the desert, Pat. And it was these beautiful desert colors. And in my desert, I drew a longhorn cow. Now, I didn't know something then that I know the artists know now, which is that you actually probably need to look at something that you're drawing when you're drawing it, right? So I drew a longhorn cow from my imagination. And I showed it to my teacher, and he said to me, Bella, I love your painting. I love your colors. And I think that your monster that you drew is very creative.
Oh no.
Oh
Oh no.
no. So that was me. Okay, I'm done with that. Right.
Yes.
And the poor man, he was trying to be so sweet and so encouraging. He just said the wrong thing at the
Yep.
wrong time. And I didn't know something important about doing art
Yep.
that I actually have learned since. And so then, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. I would still doodle,
Yeah.
but I'm not going to draw. I'm not going to paint. I'm done with that. And I think
Yep.
that happens to people on the science side too, right? So have a bad experience with math. You have a bad experience in science class where it's not taught well and you don't know what's going on. And they want you to memorize a whole bunch of boring
Yep.
stuff. And, I don't like science. Science is no good. Well, then we compartmentalize, but we also compartmentalize ourselves. And I'm
Yes.
sure you see this as saying, okay, now I am not a creative person. I am someone who's very creative. A lot of people who are great ideators say I'm very creative, but they can't ever finish something,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So we're compartmentalizing not only our fields, but how we think about ourselves, how
Oh
we define
yes.
ourselves with creativity.
In fact, as I've taught art at high school level and college level, some of my most resistant students were the high academic achievers. And let me explain this. Brilliant students. But when they came into art, and I would explain a project, show examples, and then it was up to them to create their own version or idea of what those things meant to them. And often I would get, now, what do you want me to do? And I'd say, well, you know the problem. How do you visualize it? Well, is there a right way to do this? No. What you need to think about is the idea. How do you make the idea come to life? Well, is there a formula? No, no. And it was like we were playing tennis back and forth. And so I realized maybe this is a thing where they're brilliant in terms of academic rigor and understanding formula and applying it, but they left the academic classroom, came into the art room, and all of a sudden they were floating in outer space, not very hardly tethered to some form of base. So I think this compartmentalizing is something that's really hammered in education, unfortunately. With my art students, I tell them, learn a language, study world religions, take science, take math. The worst thing in the world is to be an ignorant artist. You have to.
And you know what, Pat, in my book, I talk about how important it is for people who are in any type of other field to practice music,
Yes.
do art, read books, study something you know nothing about for the same reason, so you can break down that compartmentalization. And it's so interesting to me what you said, Pat, because that approach of I can't do the work unless I know exactly what the outcome is going to be, and I need the formula to arrive at the outcome,
Yes.
is only good in school. As soon as you get out into the real world, you're going to be faced with problems where you may know the formula, but the formula doesn't take you all the way. And now you have to start to learn. And if you don't know how to learn, which is what the scientific method, again, is about. It's about conducting experiments so you can learn something and then doing something with the learning. If you don't know how to learn, then you are going to end up getting stuck doing whatever you're doing. You're not going to be able to be the person who works on the next big innovation. You're not going to be the person who gets to start the new department, because you know how to learn a formula, but you don't know how to apply those learnings, use those learnings in a new situation, creating new experiments.
You're hitting the nail on the head, quite frankly. And it makes me wonder when we talk about creativity, for me, creativity means that you can hold contradiction. You can hold opposing thoughts in your mind. It's not black or white. It's not yes, no, good, bad. There's this beautiful shades of luscious grays and nuance of just taking something out of context where someplace else and seeing magic start to happen. So sometimes I'm just going to say this. For the last 30 years, we've had students pencil and bubble answers on standardized testing. So we have a generation now that has taken standardized testing, good, bad, right, wrong, what's the answer? And I think we're drifting away from those courses and those ideas, like in the humanities, of contradiction. What would you say about that?
Yeah, it reminds me of something that my English teacher said back in high school when we were studying poetry. And I can't remember exactly what the quote is. So I hope one of your listeners knows the quote, but it's a quote from Emily Dickinson about what poetry is. And it's something about, a real frog in an imaginary garden, something like that. So it's about taking taking those things that we haven't thought about before, and exactly what you said, putting them in a different place, and then what do you see? And so one of the things that I do when I'm teaching creativity and the creative problem solving method to people who aren't used to it is to do an exercise we call forced connections, which is to say, here's the problem we're trying to solve. I'm going to show you a picture, and I want you to, in your mind, force a connection between this completely unrelated picture and the problem we're trying to solve. So first you have to describe what's in the picture. What do you see in the picture? And then what might be some relationships between this picture and the problem you're trying to solve? Okay. So it might be, it might be a really thorny business problem. Let's show you a picture of a rose garden. Well, what do you see in the rose garden? You might see colors. I can imagine that there's smells. I can imagine, I can think that maybe there's some bees buzzing around. Maybe someone has to fertilize this garden. And so they start to get these ideas. All right, so let's force some connections between the problem we're working on and those ideas. It's kind of fun, but for some people, that's really hard.
Yes.
They look at it because I have no idea what a rose garden has to do with our problem.
Yep.
So you've
Yep.
got to practice, right? And that's
Yep.
the other thing, right? So this doesn't come from one thing. You have to practice that type of thinking. Yeah.
Yep.
Wow, Pat. And this, yeah. And it's about, people talk about right side and the left side of the brain. And I don't know if that's really true about left side and right side, but it's about, okay, so how do we bridge that? Right.
Yes.
If something's happening on the right side, what might be a left brain way of looking at it and vice versa. So my favorite question I ask people is what else? Don't stop. Yep. What else? What else? To the point that I'm annoying.
Well, I have to say, when discussing right brain, left brain, I always had a beef with that notion. I keep thinking of a bridge between right side, left side. Okay. And
there is a bridge, actually. There is a bridge. They're not disconnected.
They're not. And a bridge isn't a bridge until the first person walks across it. So
I love that.
Left side has to cross over into right side. My work is both right side, left side all the time. And I think it's a beautiful combo of what the idea needs to come to fruition. If the idea needs more left analytical research, experimentation, I'm all about it. If it needs more intuitive, playful, I'm all about it. My model that I admire is the 4-year-old in the sandbox. Now, no one tells Sally in the sandbox when she's dragging that shovel. Now, Sally, if you're making a road, it really should be this wide, and really don't make it too deep into the sand. Now, Sally's in her own world, making roads, making muddy buildings, and just losing herself in that exploration. To me, that's the ideal. If a scientist, a writer, an artist can have that kind of freedom to explore, to go all Marco Polo over whatever it is they're going after, that to me is where creativity can flourish.
Yeah, and so to your point, when we're raised in an environment of not only filling in the bubble, but also when we present something to other people, being criticized immediately,
yes.
Right? Then that joy gets taken away. Yep. So we have to get used to looking at things and asking questions about it as opposed to just criticizing it. Well, maybe that pathway could be wider. Yep. Right. But why is the pathway? Why did you make it that wide? What were you thinking about? Tell me the story. What's happening here? Because I bet in Sally's head there's little people wandering around.
Yes. Now, I'm going to come back from our discussion right now from creativity. As much as I could talk about this for hours, I'm just going to tell you that. Okay. Yeah. But I want to go back to everything I've read about you. I want my listeners to kind of get an idea. I have some basic questions. What is lean thinking?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you so much. And I made a mistake in naming my company. I named my company Lean for Humans. And when I put out ads on Facebook, I get requests from people who want to lose weight. And if you looked at me, you'd know that I'm the wrong person to come for that. So lean it's a word in business that has, I think, multiple definitions, but it comes from work that has been done looking at Japanese companies, specifically Toyota. And Toyota is very interesting because despite all companies, they've had problems over the years. They are continually innovative. They have the lowest manufacturing cost, and they never miss a product launch, which, if you think about it for a company, is really something amazing, because many companies will miss a product launch or have problems with their products at launch. And so people started to look at Toyota specifically for their manufacturing, because they do manufacturing extremely well with very high quality. And so engineering students, actually doctoral students, started to study Toyota. And what they discovered was that Toyota had some certain ways of working, which they had actually learned from Dr. W. Edwards Deming when he had gone to Japan. And they had taken those and adapted those over and over again. And they came back and they said, here are some things that Toyota does, and we're going to call this lean manufacturing. So that was great. And everybody got all excited, and they started to do something called just in time, which I don't think they understood right away. And they started to copy some of the things that Toyota did. But it pretty quickly became evident that if you copied Toyota, you didn't get the same results as Toyota. So then so people continued to study Toyota and began to look at how did Toyota manage their people, and how were they training people to deliver the results that they were delivering. And what I think that they have learned is that everybody in Toyota, every Toyota employee is trained to solve problems.
Really?
They're trained to see problems when they're happening, to be very comfortable alerting other people to problems as they're happening, stopping the work if necessary to solve the problems, and then to go through some specific problem-solving approaches, which vary according to the size of the problem. And then they come up with these amazing new approaches and tools and ways of doing things. And so what I think that we've done in the Western world is we've kind of trotted over to Japan. We've looked at Toyota, we've seen the outcome. We've said, I want the outcome. We've tried to copy the outcome, and we've failed to understand the thinking. Lean thinking is what they're doing. So what they're doing is they're teaching employees to see problems, to be comfortable sharing those problems with other people, and then working through essentially the scientific method to solve the problems. And part of that is based on what we already know, because it's an engineering environment, right? Yep. So they have a lot of stuff written down about the engineering experiments that they've done in the past. They know exactly, for a certain thickness of a certain kind of metal, what it's going to sound like when you close the door of the car. They already have that knowledge, and then they build on that knowledge. It's really hard for us to copy that, because we have, in our business environment, we have the idea that you should be able to see, if you see a problem, you should know what the solution is right away. So we hear people say in Western business, don't bring me the problem, bring me the solution. Yeah. And what Toyota would say is, show me the problem, and then let's understand the problem, and eventually we will work to getting countermeasures to that problem. And so countermeasure is different from a solution. Yes. A countermeasure is the thing that you're going to do until you find a better way of doing it. So anyway, that's a long way of saying that what lean thinking is basically teaching people to see problems and solve them, and to do that continually. And that's how we get to continuous improvement.
Well, that was my next question. You segued beautifully, because again, that comes up continuously in your work. What is continuous improvement then in the workplace?
Continuous improvement is setting a standard on how you're going to do something, and then as circumstances change, or you choose to change the circumstances, making that standard better by problem solving, by doing this experimental problem solving. So, for example, I was thinking about this morning while I was making breakfast. I was making omelets for breakfast. And if I want to make an omelet, I have a standard way of making an omelet, right? I mean, it's not that hard to make an omelet. So you need eggs, you need to break them, you need to whisk them, you need to cook them at the right temperature. You have your fillings, different ways of doing it. Now, if I make my omelet a different way every single time, it's probably going to take me longer, and I'm not always going to have a high quality omelet. So if my goal is to have an efficient, high quality omelet, one that's tasty, I want to follow a standard process. But supposing there's a certain type of cheese I like, right? And that the store's out of that cheese. Now my circumstances changed, so I'm going to use a different type of cheese. Maybe that's going to take a little longer to melt, maybe a little less time. I'm going to have to do some experiments with that cheese. Right? I know this sounds silly, so that I can have a standard for making an omelet with that cheese. So continuous improvement would be, all right, now my circumstances changed. I am able to make a different kind of omelet. Now, if you think about it, supposing I'm making omelets for a whole bunch of people and everybody has different omelets that they want, I'm going to have to change my process in order to deliver efficient, high quality omelets to more than just me and my spouse. I'm going to have to have a very different process. So I will either have like 50 people come over to my house. God forbid, I'll never do that. But supposing I had 50 people come to my house for breakfast, I would need a completely different process, right?
Yep.
And so ideally, I would improve my way to that process through a series of experiments rather than all of a sudden dealing with 50 people
So
all at once.
you're saying that the process is context driven. So when the context is 50 people show up for breakfast is very different than the context of you and your husband having omelets in the morning.
Exactly. Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And so it's about, okay, did I recognize that the circumstances changed? So, and that's one of the things that happens in business a lot is that if we set a standard, and we're not always great at setting standards, but if we set a standard, then one of the things that happens is we fail to notice that the circumstances have changed.
I got to jump in. I want
Yeah.
you to hold that thought. So when we hear, because we've always done it this way,
Mm-hmm.
okay, which to me is kiss of death. If I hear
Yeah,
those
it
words,
is.
I can feel my soul rebelling. Okay, so what you're talking about idealistically sounds beautiful, but you have these workplaces that, because they did it this way, they're slow to adapt to change. They don't want to change what they perceive as, well, this has worked for the last 40 years. Do we really need to change this?
Right. And maybe you don't need to change it, but have your circumstances changed? Right. That's the question. You're delivering something and it used to sell like crazy and now it's not selling anymore. Well, that you're going to have to change. You are working on, creating something, delivering something to people, and those customers don't exist anymore. You're going to have to change. Perhaps your employees have changed. People who were happy doing this 5 years ago, now they want to do something different. I mean, you can see this like with people now working from home, right? People don't want to come back to the offices. And this is happening right now. People, bosses are saying, come back. I want to see you in the office. And employees are saying, no,
No.
I don't want to do that. You've given me 2 years of working from home. It was great. I'm not coming back to the office. And the boss can't say, well, it worked in the past. Well, it's not going to work now. Your circumstances have changed. And so that's the other thing. I had a jet pilot on my podcast a couple of years ago. And I said to him, okay, so he was a commercial pilot at the time. I said to him, what happens when you are flying and it's a beautiful day and you're out there, there's no turbulence, you've got, presumably all of these computers actually flying the plane. What are you doing? And he said, Bella, what I'm doing is I'm scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. So that's the other piece of it, right? So it's so easy to become complacent. But if you don't, there's no point in changing if you need to deliver 6 of these things a day and people are only buying 6 and you're making enough money selling 6 a day, that's fine. You don't need to improve. But if your costs are changing, you need to improve.
Yep.
If people are demanding 12 a day, you need to improve. I mean, there's just so many reasons to do it.
So now,
but I think I was going to say the other thing is, so about change, and I'm sure you've talked about this with people before. I think people love change. If people didn't love change, they wouldn't get married. They wouldn't move house. They wouldn't have kids. They wouldn't go on vacation. People love change if they are in control of the change. So the other thing that's really important, and this is a big part of lean thinking, is making sure that people who are going to be affected by the change are as much as possible involved in creating the change and making sure the change actually benefits them. Now, sometimes, you're working with a company with 100,000 people, you're not going to be able to involve everyone, but you've got to involve enough people that they know why it's important, and then they can tell their colleagues and their friends.
Well, then you bring up a good point. People do like change, but people do not like breaking their routine. I have always thought that was an interesting dichotomy, that we're creatures of routine. We know when we grab that coffee in the morning, that's the beginning of the start of our day. There's certain rituals we have, things that we do, but then there's change. And we long and hunger to change. which means we disrupt our routine. So it's really kind of a murky area that people don't want to break the routine, but yet they know they want to make a change.
What I wonder about that is when we're doing something that is routine like that,
Yeah.
we are able to go on automatic pilot and
Mm.
free our brain and our energy for other things. And so I think that in changing a routine, it's more than just the effort to change routine. It's also that you have to expend in some way different energy. And so it's
Ah,
actually, it costs to change a routine because you're going to have to form a new habit.
yep.
And if you are in an environment of continuous improvement, you are going to have to get in the habit of forming new habits all the time. And I think that does take more energy. And
Good point. Yes. Yeah.
so be prepared for that. It's not going to be just, well, now I'm getting up an hour earlier. Or I'm giving up coffee. Oh my goodness, giving up coffee, right? Suppose you give up coffee. All right. So how much extra energy is it going to take for you to find something else to drink or, or
Yeah.
to live
Yeah.
without that caffeine boost or whatever it is?
So you're talking about change. It's almost like you wrote my script of questions. I mean, you're just ahead of me. In the past 2.5 years, the world has radically changed. Institutions, workplace, education, religious institutions, across the board, a medical facility, everything is not as we have known it in the past. And when you talk about the workplace, you're right. People have been working from home. And I've heard friends say who work in corporate America, they want me to come back to the office. I'm not going to do it. There are people that just, they saw something on the other side of that stay at home fence and working. And then you had the workers who kept this country going, the ones that had to work in warehousing, garbage disposal, groceries, postal.
Mm-hmm.
Those people, in some ways, bore a stressful brunt of making sure the country kept moving. So now we have 2+ years of high stress levels. The workplace is not what we know it to be. How does that affect how you approach talking to people in the workplace?
That is such a great question. I think the biggest struggle right now is in the hybrid workplace. So if everybody's on Zoom or whatever Microsoft Teams or whatever you're using, there are great tools that have been developed over the past few years for people to collaborate together and work together electronically. But we were never able to figure out, I think, in that time, how to connect that to the people who were in the workplace.
Okay.
An example I'll give you is one of the very important concepts in lean thinking and in managing from a lean perspective is this idea of what we call going to the Gamba, which means going to the actual place where work is done. In the past, what a manager would be told to do would be you can't sit in your office and not worry about what's happening on the factory floor and then yell at people because you're not getting the results that you want. You actually need to go on the factory floor or in the science-based business, you need to go in the lab and you need to observe what's happening and you need to ask people what's happening and you need to find out what's going on. You need to see work happening in the actual place it's happening. So one of the things that was very hard during the pandemic was a lot of times sort of the managers were at home and the consultants, so, these people were at home and some people were still, as you said, in the factories, in the warehouse, driving
Yeah.
the delivery truck. And you couldn't be there with them. And so there were all kinds of ways that people tried to see what was still going on, but it wasn't the same as being there. And I think we're in the same situation now when you have employees and managers who, for whatever reason, are still working at home, and some people are working in the office. Going to the Gamba, going to see what's actually happening is still really hard. In fact, it's harder. You're not going to go to somebody's house and sit with them while they work on an Excel spreadsheet. I mean, that's never really been an option, right? And, if everybody was all together, it would be okay. If everyone was at home, then we'd all be facing the same environment. But in the hybrid environment that we're going to continue to have, I think we have a lot of work to do. Figure out how do we do this? Because then I always say this, it's about the people and the people's ability to see and solve problems. And if I'm at home and somebody that I'm working with is working in an office or a factory
Yep.
or in a lab, and I can't actually see what they're doing, I'm never going to be able to ask the right questions to help to coach them to solve their problems. It's just not going to work.
Yeah.
And I don't know yet. I mean, maybe there's someone who's listening who knows the answer. If so, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'd love to know how are we gonna do that? How are we going to be hybrid? How are we going to let people work from home and have people working in the office and really understand the work that we're all doing and see and solve problems together? It's something we've got to figure out. I don't have an answer.
Well, it seems
Um,
like we're all in the process of rewriting. I know education is going through just convulsive changes given COVID. And
yeah,
so, especially when you think of science classes, art classes where you have to be in the classroom, these things are going through a fundamental change. And so, I don't know, maybe there's a dark angel in this COVID thing that it's forced us to really reinvent how we live now, how we be in the world. It's not business as usual. And so maybe this is where we come back and say, we're not going to use that early 20th century industrial model of the workplace. We're going to do something different. The ideal is a Toyota approach where you respect the workers and see them as resources that they can problem solve, bring things up to your attention, not just workers on the line, keeping the line going. So
right, right.
it's really calling up for us to really look in our heart of hearts here. How do we want to be?
And it's especially hard, I think. You said it so right about the Toyota model, which is about respect for people. And in order to really truly respect an individual as opposed to respect for people in the abstract, you need to know them. You
Yes.
can't, right? And it's very difficult to know somebody when you are not able to spend time with them,
Yep.
when you're not able to be with them. And I think the other thing that is really, and I see this happening with my clients a lot, that is making it even harder is the back-to-back meeting culture, right?
Yes.
So it's not just that you don't really have time to do work unless, I mean, sometimes you are doing work in a meeting. And I think that it's very important when you're working collaboratively that you do meet and do that work. But sometimes, we have meetings because we need to do updates and all this other kind of stuff. When you have back to back to back to back meetings, you could be bumping into
Yep.
people all day long, virtually or physically, but you never know them. You never get to know those people. You never have that time for that conversation about, tell me what's going on in your life.
Yep.
What is your plan for the weekend? All those things that help us understand what motivates people. And so that's the other thing and I see this with my kids, especially, that they really value not working. And it's not that they're not industrious people who want to do a good job for their employers, but they value not working and they value spending time with their friends. I think in a way that in my generation, I felt it was not quite as accepted, right? When I was sort of coming up in the industry I came up in, it was much more about continuous dedication to the
Oh, yes.
Company
Yes.
and much less time for expected time or valued time for spending
Yep.
time with friends and family,
Yep.
And then, of course, that's a whole other conversation about what that does
Yep.
to people who are trying to raise families and into women and all the rest of it.
Yes.
But that's another
It
conversation,
is,
Pat.
but you do bring up an interesting point. I saw that Portugal passed legislation that employers cannot call their employees or contact them digitally, phone, anything after the end of the workday. They cannot
Wow.
do that. And I think France did it too. And Europe has always had this kind of family first attitude, then work. And
Right.
in this country, it's work, corporate. Oh, and you have a family. And if you're a woman, oh, you take care of the family and you show up and you do this too. So again, maybe this COVID business has shaken us now to the point 2 years of being around family, I kind of like this. I like being around my family. I love working, but I love this too, that connection. So maybe some good will come out of that as well.
I think it already has in some ways. I mean, I certainly see with the people in my family that well, sometimes I have to say the parents are anxious to get away from the kids for
Yeah.
a bit.
Yes. Yes, I
You know,
understand.
they like that to happen. Just, well, I don't see the value in commuting anymore. They say, like, what's the point of
Yeah.
losing this time in my day to commute?
Yeah.
So then if you're going to say that, then how are we going to, the problem then we have to address is how do we make sure we are really getting to know each other so we
Yes.
can work well together? And that's a problem we need to continue to work on solving so that we can be collaborative and work together. And, there's no fabulous new product that's on the market, Pat. I'm sure you know this, that was put out there by one person.
No.
Pat's artwork is not hanging in a building because Pat did that all by herself,
No.
right?
No.
Right,
Never.
right.
No.
Never.
It's
Yeah.
many people involved.
Yeah. So if I could just take a minute just to talk
Please.
about just really quickly how I combine creativity and lean problem solving.
Yes,
And
please.
I could talk about that for 48 hours and you don't need to hear that, but it's actually pretty simple. So what I tell people is in creativity, there are really two styles of thinking. The first style is the style of divergence. And that's exactly what you were talking about, where you're going to think different things. You're going to come up with different ideas, different possibilities, different solutions. And some people are super comfortable doing that. A lot of people who go into sort of the lean continuous improvement stuff as a business are not as comfortable with that.
Okay.
They're more comfortable with the other side of creative thinking, which is convergent thinking, which is when you are improving your ideas, when you are selecting what you're going to move forward with, and eventually you get to making final decisions about what you're going to do. So a lot of people who do lean, not everybody, but a lot of people who do lean are much more comfortable with decision making, moving forward, picking something, and they get overwhelmed if there are too many possibilities that they have to choose from. And then there are the other people who will come up with ideas right, left, and center, but are actually not interested in or don't get energy from the process of choosing and improving. And as a friend of mine once said, putting wheels on the car, right? That's not, I like to imagine the car, but I don't want to be the one who's actually putting the wheels on it. So you need to have both types of thinking in order to come up with something innovative, because it's not innovative if you thought of it and didn't make it real. And it won't be innovative if you immediately make a decision about what you're going to do without exploring a number of options. So what I teach is in each step of the lean problem solving process, the plan, do, check, act process, we want to make sure that we understand what type of thinking do we need, and are we deliberately thinking divergently or deliberately thinking convergent? And if we're the kind of person who's more comfortable with convergent thinking, have we spent enough time in our divergent thinking? So in the plan stage, which is when we are kind of looking at the problem and thinking about what's my experiment that I'm going to do to start to understand the problem or start to solve the problem, are we spending enough time looking at all the different possibilities before we decide one we're going to move forward with and do an experiment on, right? So that's divergence and convergence. And then there's do, which is doing the experiment. I always say when you're doing experiment, to be a good scientist, you don't mess around with the experiment, right? You do the experiment. But then in the check stage, or some people say study stage, when you look at the results of the experiment, again, you want to use some divergent thinking. Have I really understood what these results mean? What are some of the possibilities about what these results might mean? Did I miss something in the environment, right? And then your convergence step is going to be, which one of these do I want to take some learning from and move back into the act stage, which is often going back around this cycle again. So it's just about being deliberate about, I know I'm being divergent and now I'm being convergent. And if you're not comfortable with one style of thinking or the other, you got to surround yourself with some other folks who are. And the convergent thinking people have to have a little patience with the people who think divergently. And the divergent thinking people have to have a little patience with the people who think convergently. Well, it helps to practice with each other. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Yeah.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Between divergent and convergent thinkers, how do you avoid confirmation bias?
Well, and what confirmation bias? So, yeah, great question, Pat. So that's where, like with a scientific background, I like real data, right? And the other thing is, and this is where in science, peer review comes in. So peer review is when you have other people look at how did you design your experiment. Perhaps you even have that happen. Ideally, you have something that happen before you run the experiment. And you have people look at the results and say, did you consider this, right? So bringing in a few more people, but from a scientific point of view, it's about, are you really looking at the data? And are you looking, and this is what I think is hard, are you looking at the data with the idea that you might actually be suffering from confirmation bias, because you
Yes.
probably are, right? You got to think about it.
Yeah.
Say, you know what? I really want the answer to be this. So what am I not looking at, because I want the answer to be that, right?
You
Yeah.
use it as a reverse barometer in a
Yeah.
sense. Now,
Yeah, boy. Great question, Pat.
thank you. You use a phrase, get out of the way of your own creativity. I've seen that.
Yeah.
Okay, I want you to talk about that. What do you mean, get out of the way of your own creativity? I can learn here. Please.
So I wrote the book, and it's a business novel. It's about a middle manager. And so I have a lot of sympathy for middle managers, because even though I had a very exalted title when I was working in the pharmaceutical company, because it was such a big company, I was still a middle manager,
Okay.
right? There was still people above me. And then I had people reporting to me. And the middle manager is just squashed in the middle between wanting to meet the goals and objectives of the people below, but above, but also at the same time, getting essentially productivity out of the people who are working for them, and hopefully also developing them. It's really hard. And so the default mode I observe for middle managers is control. And so if your default mode is control, then you're going to be very, very uncomfortable with other people's divergent thinking.
Yes.
So somebody will come to a middle manager with an idea, and a middle manager, and I tell this story in my book, even if they are trained in innovation, if it hits them in some way that's the wrong way, they'll say no. Right. So now they're stopping the creativity in their organization, because it's not necessarily about your own creativity. It's about the creativity of all the people around you, all the people working for you. How do you unleash their creativity? And the first thing you have to do is to get comfortable letting go of some control and allowing experimentation around things that you might not think are a good idea. As Mike Rothfuss says, he's a wonderful lean thinker, says you can control the size of the explosion, right? You can insist on small experiments when that's necessary, but you have to develop some self-awareness that it is the default mode of middle management for self-preservation to maintain control. And
boy, that is a huge insight. It's huge, because I've heard the expression, people leave a job because of lack of respect and a bad manager. I've heard that over and over again. And in education, I believe it. I've learned it. And you're really bringing home, you just broke down the why of it. When people get frustrated with managers, they go to them with great ideas. No, I don't think so. And they feel like they're hitting their head against the wall. And you just gave us the backstory.
And think about how hard it is for the manager. If the manager is not supported by their manager in creativity and creative things happening, then they are undertaking great personal risk to allow that type of experimentation, right? So ideally, that is permitted all through a company. And if you're a middle manager who is really stuck with a manager yourself who's not comfortable with experimentation, then you've got a job to do to essentially train your boss on why this is important and what the benefits are going to be. And sometimes that can be really hard. It's really get out of your own way. Stop saying no when you don't have to say no. Let people do experiments. Encourage ideas, encourage divergent thinking, ask what else. Don't let people settle for the first solution they come up for. Don't say, bring me a problem, bring me a solution. Say, bring me a problem and I'll help you find a solution. It's a different way of thinking, but it's not easy in some organizations. I wouldn't say it's a cure-all.
Well, I have to say, as we wind down from this discussion, I want to leave it at this wonderfully high point. And I have to tell you, Bella, this is as close as you can come to you coming over to the studio. I get out coffee and we start talking. This was like a studio visit with you. And I just love your insights and your knowledge. And thank you so much for sharing and sharing yourself the way you do.
Oh, thank you, Pat. It's really been a pleasure. It's so lovely to get to know you. And I want to see your art someday.
I have my artworks up on a website.
Oh, great.
So yeah, I'll send that to you. But again, thank you for being on Fill to Capacity. And folks, if you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe. So thank you, Bella.
Thank you, Pat.
Take care.
You too.